What we want to do in this panel is hear from some of the people who are engaged with us in this great GCRF enterprise. And I'll introduce my fellow panelists in a moment, but let me just say a few words first, if I may. So Mark's pointed out, we've got this range of principles, this range of things that GCRF funding is supposed to enable us to do. Excellence with impact matters. The ODA compliance thing, but ODA compliance, as Mark said, in a purposive way, not just a letter of the law way. What's it about? True partnership. And I think delivering that true partnership is if we can really change the way we go about partnership in delivering research for global challenges, then if nothing else, this whole GCRF enterprise will have achieved a lot. I think part of the problem we face often is that we from UK and indeed a range of other universities will turn up in Bangladesh, Africa, wherever, and say, well, we've got this brilliant project, this brilliant program, do you want to join us? Rather than say, well, actually, let's look at how we can address things together and co-design and co-develop ideas. And for me, that partnership is about partnership from inception through to delivery and through to, as Mark says, legacy. So that we all look back after having done the research that we're engaged in and say, that made a difference and that matters to us. So how do we pull together work that is truly partnership work, truly co-designed from cradle through to grave, when the grave leaves a legacy that we can all be proud of and look back on and go, yes, that was an enterprise worth doing, in a way that's compliant with the various requirements that Mark set out around how funding is spent. If we can achieve that together, then I think that will make a very, very, very significant difference, not just to us addressing individual global challenges, but also to the way that we work together in our scientific endeavour. So that's the theme really of this panel. I'm going to ask in a moment, I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then each of them will give five or 7 minutes presentation of some of their thoughts around some particular themes. And we want this to be stimulating a debate. So once we've done that, we actually get to involve you guys, and the rest of this meeting is about involving you guys. In fact, I'm absolutely stunned that a bunch of academics have remained quiet for such a long time, but I'm sure that's going to change as we go forward. So let me introduce my panel. First of all, Ferdows. Ferdows Janan is Professor of Public Administration at the University of Dhaka. And Ferdows has had the longest to come. So that's why she sat next to me. So if the jet lag kicks in, I give her a little nudge. That's what we agreed. Ferdows is an expert in programme evaluation and policy research. Her current research spans governance, social protection, urban poverty, legal empowerment of the poor, and women's empowerment issues in developing nations. I should say that this is actually one of the themes, particularly around gender violence, that is the focus of what we brought together with our African network that I spoke about earlier. Leading on from that, and I think Ferdows is going to talk about partnerships when we get to her. Then Madara Ogot is from Nairobi. Madara actually was part of our leading our Nairobi workshop, which Leicester and University of Nairobi co-hosted earlier this year. He's been a leader in developing that relationship as we've gone forward. Is, I think, a co-PI with one of our colleagues here in Leicester around air quality, so is doing the research with us as well as, I think, trying to develop the future of our joint enterprise. Madara is University of Nairobi Director for Research and Extension. Prior to that post, he was Managing Director of a range of enterprises, and he was Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Maseno University. Then Soston Sostin Chiotha. Sostin is from Malawi, from the University of Malawi. He's a regional director of the Leadership for Environment and Development for Southern and Eastern Africa, or LEAD. And Malawi is one of the universities that's come together with us in this new network in Africa and looking at co-design. Sostin served as the first board chair of the Malawi National Commission of Science and Technology, so he absolutely understands the policy directions and the requirements for science and technology in his country, in his area. He's worked on the Malawi National Environment Action Plan and the Malawi Climate Change and Meteorological Policy. So it's even a science area that I can pronounce the words in, which is always nice. And then finally, and who's going to start off the session for us is Paul van Gardingen, at the end, my far right. I've introduced Paul already. He's recently joined Leicester as Deputy Pro-Vice-Chancellor for International and Development Research. I managed to pinch Paul from Edinburgh, which is a good thing to do for all kinds of reasons. Paul was director of the ESPA project, Ecosystems for Poverty Alleviation Project, which is a very significant project funded by DFID, by ESRC and by NERC. And he was also UNESCO Chair for International Development there. Paul's going to start our discussion by giving us a brief overview of some of the principles underpinning global practice in research collaboration at the moment. So, Paul, over to you.
Well, thanks, Ian, and I would like to join Ian in welcoming you all to Leicester. This is an amazing part of the country. It's a fantastic institution, and it's an area where we try to live these principles about working in partnership, in respect. Mark's word, which really struck me, was the word of equity. It's about doing research which is respectful, which is equitable in the way that we do research, and the results are equitable. And with that in mind, atypically for me, I'm not going to say much this morning, at least try not to, because the experts in how to do this type of research are sitting at the front. And I actually want you to have the opportunity to hear them, but also to interact. Now, before I go on, behind me I've stuck up a few other ways that you can interact, as well as just asking questions, and also to remind you this is being web streamed. So if you're on a web stream, you can use our Twitter feed, our email. If you're in the room, remember everything you say on the microphone will also be going out and be recorded, so just keep that in mind. So, as Ian said, I've been working in this area, well, in terms of development research for my entire career, and have gone from a very old style work before we actually had what would be called ODA research, through to transiting programs to think about poverty alleviation, and then leading what was one of the UK's largest interdisciplinary programs for almost 7 years. And as a result, I've done literally hundreds of these events, and anybody who's been to the event knows to look at the tie. The tie has a message. Our research is all about people. And what I want you to think about today is how can we do exactly what Mark is saying, impactful research based on excellence, which is going to change lives, and change lives for the better. And what I want to share with you today is a few little thoughts leading into my excellent colleagues' more detailed discussion about what this actually looks like. And I want to learn from a number of things. Previous projects, as Ian said, I used to be until I came here, I was the director of the UK's ESPA programme. And when I left, that had over 100 projects, 52 countries, just under 1,000 researchers, which is stunning. Actually, we had more than that. We just couldn't tie them down. And it was really interesting to do that. And if you look at the map, you can see where it was working. And this is, GCRF is taking that and putting it into really the stratosphere, the scale of ambition. But as Mark pointed out, there comes a responsibility with that. which is we have to use this excellence, work in partnership, in equity, and produce results. So, in terms of putting together our panel, I've looked for people that I've worked with and interacted with over the last decade, who I know are so committed and I see as being experts. So the image up here comes from a project that Soston was involved in, and going into the field and meeting the people who are the beneficiaries is my greatest privilege in life. These meetings are great, but until you as a researcher go and talk to the people who your research is meant to impact, I don't believe you can understand it. So when we talk about partnership, I also believe that includes the potential beneficiaries, because they will tell you what matters to them. They will give you the ground truthing about whether your research has even got a chance of being used. So this was a project in Malawi, which I just love. It was also working in Colombia and Peru, which was speaking to Mark's aspiration about getting these comparative. We also need to learn together and from each other. So one of the things that Ian and I did in March this year was to host, with our colleagues from the University of Nairobi, Dara, a workshop saying, okay, how do we turn around these power dynamics so that research in the future is done much more equitably? And we're pulling that together. Actually, having our colleagues here today is another aspect of that commitment. I'm also trying to pull together some of the outcomes, and I'm going to present a little bit today, but again, speak our thing. So, before I went to the Nairobi workshop, I went to a small community in Gazi Bay, just south of Mombasa. And again, notice here, what was I doing? I wasn't talking to researchers, I was talking to community members, fishers, a few researchers, extension workers saying, so how can we do something which is going to be benefiting them? And they've got big problems about fisheries, loss of tourism, they have an important carbon sink. But I find that only by bringing in this broad-based voice do I understand what the research is. We then went to Nairobi, and a number of colleagues in the room were involved in this, and said, how do we change the way we work? And since my appointment here, one of my key deliverables is making this real in the way that we work. So I want, my criteria for personal success is changing the way we as the University of Leicester works internationally. It's not just about getting grants, it's changing the way that we work and changing and enhancing the impact we have in the world. So, we can look at the UK. I think it's also really important to look at other programs which have got things to share. So one of the documents we used in Nairobi, if you haven't seen this document, it's really, really useful. It gives you 11 principles and is it seven questions. It could well be one of the very useful hours of your life reading this, because go through this and it makes you change the way you think. For example, here are some of the principles you can work through. This is not the only document. I think some of our speakers will talk to some others, but there's lots of experience outside the UK which is relevant. And this is my opportunity to start sharing with you. It's a journey that we as an institution are going on, and it's a journey that we would so welcome to go on with others around this room, because it's not about competing with each other as far as I'm concerned. Yes, there's a degree of that, but it's actually working together in partnership to improve the world. So, this is the work in progress. It's saying, if we're going to be thinking about how we do research, there's lots of different points in time and different stakeholders that need to interact. So at the top left, if you think about Mark and his team are starting to arrange a number of these 4 regional engagement ones, they're actually working in that top left thing. Okay, we can say setting the agenda has been set by the SDGs, by some of the other programming things, but that next thing is agreeing the research priorities. So my next GCRF engagement is going to be going to the first of these regional events in Colombia, and I'm really looking forward to that. And I know my colleagues there are just so excited about the opportunity to feed into this. What I'm going to do today is ask my colleagues to pick off 3 cells in this. And these are the ones where researchers move. So first of all, I believe that research of this type is interdisciplinary, but in its nature, it's also a social process. And the most important part of that, from day zero, is treating this as a partnership. And I can think of nobody better to talk about this than Firdaus, and she's going to lead off. But just bringing that group together is not sufficient. We also need to make sure that we ask appropriate questions, the right questions, the questions which are likely to address the problem, and the questions which are likely to produce results which can change it. And the interesting thing is, when you do it that way, you don't necessarily get the next incremental change in what you've done before. You are actually looking for a step change in the science you do and the way you do it. So Madura's going to talk about that. And then, as both Ian and Mark have said, in the past we've had excellence, 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 and a little bit of added impact at the end. I believe, and Mark highlighted this, is that you actually build impact into your design from the very, very start. And that's why I've asked Sostin to end giving his ideas of how you do this. The reason I chose Sostin is when I was visiting a lot of government departments, I can remember very, very well meeting a very senior official in the University of Malawi, in the government of Malawi. And we were talking about some of the research that's been done, and he said, how are you going to get this used? And I said, well, we've got a really talented person working on that site. And I said, oh, who's that? I said, oh, Sostin. He said, there's someone who knows how to do it. So I wanted you to hear from Sostin himself on how to do it. So I'm going to stop now and ask Firdaus to talk about these effective, equitable, and fun partnerships.
You? Okay.
It's up to you.
Up to you.
Okay. Okay, how about a good partnership? You offer the slides there and I sit here. It's good, right?
I'll try to find who stole my clicker.
Okay, here it is. Okay. Okay.
I hope you like the passive chairmanship, by the way.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for this opportunity. So Paul asked me to talk about partnership. And he said, you're the best person. You know how to do it. You have been so many partners in so many research. I said, yeah, okay. So I started thinking yesterday, actually, what is partnership? Do I really know what it is? Am I kidding myself and all of us? Like, what do you mean by this? And then I started thinking, actually, not really. Based on my, at least last 12 years experience of partnership with UK colleagues and universities and think tanks, I kind of thought about it, like how I have kind of accepted and dealt with partnerships. And it seems that we still has a kind of hegemonic idea of partnership is about building my capacity. So that's the first thought that I had when I was just trying to put up some slides. So I think that the most important thing for us to start conceptually in thinking about it, that we have to redefine the concepts. And we have to come out of this post-World War II connotation of transfer of skills, technology, and systems from developed to developing countries. I think we have come a long way from there, but I think we still don't know that we have. Even in both parties, like even in Bangladesh, and sometimes, like when I have to talk to policymakers, I take people like Paul or someone, a white man with me, so our policymakers would listen to them. So it's not about that this the developed countries are trying to undermine the developing countries, but it's a holistic mindset that we all have to come out of. So, and then what happens is that because of this, so that's the intellectual or conceptual idea that I thought I'd share with you. But then let's talk about the practicalities, what it means when you talk about today's partnerships, right? So, and I'm talking based on my partnerships, especially ESRC, DFID research partnerships. And so what happens is the good thing about the partnerships that we had is that we can really engage in participatory and inclusive process if we want to generate global knowledge and solutions to problems. And this kind of delicate balance between universalism versus context, the particularism, like how do you bring that balance? What elements of universal application can be contextualized and implemented well? So this is something that really helps. Like it is I think is the most important thing, and partnerships do really speak to that. And because of ICT, we can really work well. Just to give an example, like we were working in a project, like it was funded mostly by DFID with IDEA's colleagues. So our researchers were collecting data in tablets, and they were uploading it in the system. And the IDEA's colleagues, like with 5-hour, 6-hour time difference, around 11 a.m. in the morning, he would see what data has been entered and what questions we have. So this ICT actually, and the time difference really helps. Like, so we can kind of work, like I figured out that these days I have only 2 hours of blind spot when nobody is emailing me or talking to me, so sorry. And other 22 hours, someone is emailing, someone is trying to connect. So that's the best thing about what we can do. So these are the good things, but then institutions do vary. There are structures, there are culture. For example, the university that I come from, the University of Dhaka, we have this inclusion, like everybody, all faculty members will have to be included in any project, no matter what it is about. And the seniority matters. So he is a senior professor, he knows what is best, regardless of if it knows or she knows or nothing of this sort. So this is kind of the culture that we have to navigate through, we have to work through. So, and then some institutions can learn. For example, I work with BRAC, which learns really quickly, fast we learn, and they can cope better. At the same time, my original employment, Dhaka University, it really struggles. And its due diligence is kind of different words for us. So it's kind of this kind of gap between understanding, capacity, between us. So this is something that we have to deal with when you talk about partnership. And then the added complexities, what we have, multidisciplinary. So you need the scientist, you need the social scientist, you need the communities. So everyone has to come together to do a project. Multi-institutions, combination of research and actions. So we, the poor university professor, we think we are good at teaching than implementing things. So that's why we came to academia, right? We can say anything and we can, okay, we have given the lectures because of the students who are listening to us. And now you want us to do everything and then bring in value for money, impacts. So too much to do, right? So you're asking us to, so how do we get there? So these complexities take a toll on the potential results, and as well as on the team leader who becomes a manager. And really the PI, the team, either they start micromanaging or become so hands-off that the potential sometimes get lost in this kind of complexity of partnership. Nonetheless, I have one experience to share, that it was ESRC-funded projects on food rights and food riots. So we have all the problems, but it was a 4-country research. Each country team included an UK-based and a country-based co-investigators, equal responsibility of co-investigators. And PI played a role of an excellent coordinator, not a hierarchical team leader, providing decisions, like coordinating. So we are all academics, we're all researchers, and we have each country team has one UK-based and one country-based researcher. And even we had one inception workshop in Kenya, the other final workshop in IDS Sussex. So kind of weighing that where we will be going. And the financial allocations was really transparent. And the fees and salaries not based on country of citizenships. So that was really this one example that I wanted to share. There are many learnings, but this is one example that I wanted to share. And with regards to impact, what I would say that my experience have been, in last week, I met the Food Policy Monitoring Unit of the Bangladesh government, and the head of the unit, I went to interview him about a project. Instead, he spent 3 hours trying to convince me that how we should engage in food research in food market, in stakeholders, and why it's important for next 10 years for me to do the research so that that's the contribution that I can make to Bangladesh and Bangladesh government. So the impact actually does happen. So we don't have to really look for impact or policy changes. We have to look at how it's happening. So I think we do a pretty good job. And on another note, I met a program director of a street children project in Bangladesh. She had multi-million-dollar street children project of the government. And he said, can you please do a research for me, a solution-oriented, what we can do? So when we do research well, when we have partnership well, the impact happens. So my learning is that when we think about collaborative research, I think the co-production, as both Pauls were saying, is extremely important. And I think that we have learned a lot. There are some negative experiences as well, but I would just end with a positive note that there are possibilities, and we're very excited about it. So thank you so much again.
Thanks, Ferguson. I think the partnership between you and Paul and the slides almost worked.
You've got to kick me.
Madara, over to you.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Yeah, I was just making sure that you're still awake. And I see that you are. You've been very quiet for quite some time. I opted to stand up because sitting down is a little difficult for me. Jim Collins wrote a book, for those who are familiar with the business sector, called From Good to Great, talking about companies. And one of the key things brought up there is great companies. I added that, but in context of the rest. First, get the right people on the bus. The bus is talking about the companies themselves. The right people in the right seats, basically doing the right job, and then figure out where to drive it. Essentially, this is the issue of the partnerships that we're talking about, that it's essential that as you form your research questions, you already have the right people, the right partnerships, they're in their right positions, with the right competencies, before you begin to form the research questions. Often you find that the PIs or the lead institutions already come with questions and solutions and impose them on partners. And a lot of times, those projects don't work out very well. I want to take this quote in the context of one example that we have looked at, of which we have funding between University of Nairobi, University of Leicester, funded by the Newton Fund, as well as our local Kenyan National Research Fund. So this isn't so much the technical aspects that we look at, but the process that we went through to actually come up with research questions that we believe were viable. It's very hard to see, and I'm sorry the text is small, but in this case, we brought a series of stakeholders and partners together to try and formulate what would be the research question in the context of the nexus of three things. We're actually looking at health, air quality, as well as poverty and vulnerable groups in Nairobi metropolitan area. So that's the area we wanted to work in, but we weren't sure exactly what should we work in. We brought together University of Nairobi, University of Leicester. NEMA is our National Environment Management Agency in charge of all environmental regulations and policy. NTSA is our National Transport Safety Authority. Transport in Nairobi is the key pollutant, not manufacturing. They're in charge of all the regulations and enforcements and inspections. And General Motors Kenya, we also brought them in. They're the largest manufacturer and seller of buses in Nairobi, and therefore they're also the largest contributor to pollution in Nairobi, as we'll talk through. So after a brainstorming session, we came up with all these issues that you see scattered. That's just an abridged version, the many things that came up through various meetings that we went through, collectively and together. We then tried to put them all together in that web that you see. And again, I've just put an abridged version of the web. But the key thing that we want to look at was to say, what would be the key problem that we want to work on after all those ideas have come together? And there was the issue of poor air quality and its impact on vulnerable groups. And that is essential for two reasons. The large majority of Nairobi's population actually walks to work. And they walk right along the roadside. And we also have significant pollution from our motor vehicles, especially in terms of particulate matter. And a lot of them also in the informal sector conduct their businesses along the same roadside. And so we thought that these would be the vulnerable groups to look at. So that initially was our key problem that we wanted to see. So we said, okay, fine, what are the impacts? And I'll just take you to the utmost one, that there's a significant number of premature deaths due to the poor air quality. And then a lot of people get sick, so they also miss work. Now, most of this group are casual workers. You get paid on a daily basis. So if you miss work, you don't get paid. And therefore, that became important. Below the red box and the key problem, we said, all right, what are the issues and how are they related? So we look at what we call deficient outputs. We looked at the policies and institutions, what is there, what is missing, what's not working so well, as you can see listed. And then even below that, we said then, what is the inputs? What is missing? What are some of the things that can be tackled in the so-called cause-effect diagram that you see there? Then we said, all right, based on our interest, our competencies, funds that are available, resources that are available, the time limits that we have for the projects we are looking at, what can we work on? We cannot solve all those problems identified. And that's the ones you see there with the bold boxes. Nairobi has no continuous air quality monitoring program. So we know the air is bad, but we don't know how bad. We don't know what the key pollutants are. We don't know what their sources primarily are. We're guessing it's mainly transport. We don't know how it changes with seasons. It's also a little bit unique because half of it opens up to a plain, and there's a lot of organic dust also that blows into the city. How does that interact with everything else? And so we thought, let us tackle that as our initial problem. And so the issue of the absence of an air quality monitoring program, we said, let us set up one as one of our key areas so that we will be able to get some of these issues. You have the issue of the buses already polluting. There are methods to retrofit buses, but most of them are expensive. Most of them require clean fuels, of which we don't have, or fuel still has high sulfur content. So what can we do? And so we said, let's investigate what is possible. And then do a cost-benefit analysis. I know it seems really bad to put a cost on human life, but it's the real cost to retrofitting all the vehicles. Do a cost-benefit analysis. Some of that already has not been done. And then that would begin to answer some of the questions and begin to influence policy as well. And therefore, we go from red to green. Green means happy, nice. So these are the things that, if the project was successful, this is what we plan to achieve. It's an ongoing project. We would now have the presence of a continuous air quality monitoring program. We would have a good or better understanding of the costs involved and the benefits that can be achieved by some of the retrofitting programs we're producing. Would be able to have a better understanding of the sources of pollution, their variation with seasons. We'll also have a better understanding as well of, if you look further up in impacts, of what are some of the direct relationships between the air quality as well as mobility and mortality as well. And finally, because NEMA is actually set up regulations already for air quality and they're already beginning to put measures in, now they'll have a means to see what the impacts of those measures are, because now they'll have data over a long period of time. Notice that this appears to work only because all those who were involved in the process were involved in coming up with some of these research questions, and they will be the direct beneficiaries once those results begin to come out. So my final slide is there for that. Working together in strong partnerships, again, that theme comes out throughout, researchers and stakeholders, not just us academics, but you must involve the stakeholders as well, are then able to ask the right research questions and also ask the right questions and also form the right research questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Madara. Let's go straight to Susan.
Good morning once again. As Paul has indicated, I come from Malawi, but of course my master's was at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, so I should be talking about bilharzia, but I'd now talk about environment climate change and delivering impact in general. So that's how far I've shifted away from looking under the microscope. But because I was interested in bilharzia, I developed an interest in a lake in Malawi called Lake Chirwa, which has about 7,000 fishermen. And I was interested in finding out how they get exposed to bilharzia, which you get infected from contaminated waters. And then the lake, 1996, it dried completely. And 5,000, 7,000 fishermen out of work. And still wearing the original hat of that kind of researcher, hard-nosed scientist, I put up a team of researchers in biodiversity, in health, going there, and we're looking at what has happened to the fish, what has happened to the birds, and what has happened to the cycle of the disease. And so we had this international conference where we presented that. And several recommendations on follow-up research. Nothing happened. And the questions we were getting is, what happened to the people? What happened to the women? What happened to the children? How about the food production? What happened when the lake dried? And these are the questions that we had overlooked. So when you're talking about delivering impact, you need to be mindful of the impacts. So some expected research impacts are obvious. We know that we're building knowledge. We also know that we are building critical thinking and learning skills. And the ESPA project that we had actually fulfilled those very well. We had a number of master's, PhD, as well as postdoc attached to the project, trekking between Malawi and the UK. So that was fulfilled. In terms of building knowledge, there were quite a number of papers that actually came out. And so we're fulfilling the excellency that we in academia expect. However, there was also the need to influence policy. But in addition to that, to support development programs that deliver better services. We're talking about well-being, and most of these were mentioned when the SDGs were presented. So what do you do if you want to influence the policy? Policy development is not linear. It's quite a convoluted path. So you cannot say that, after the project is done, then we'll go and engage with the policymakers. So what needs to be done is the core design of projects. You need to have the policy makers involved. From the problem identification, they should be involved. But also, researchers should invest in outreach and engagement strategies that not only target the policy makers, but also other key stakeholders. And we discovered that when you do that, it worked out very well. We were talking to the policymakers, but the other key stakeholders were NGOs that have better advocacy skills. And whenever we generated information, they got that information packaged in a way that policymakers would understand, in a way that community leaders would understand. And therefore, that multiple pathways is what needs to be considered at the beginning of the project. Impact definition may vary among stakeholders. So we can say that we will have policies produced, yes. Publications, yes. But those may not be enough because they will not affect all the stakeholders, or they might affect stakeholders maybe in the long term. But there are some others that need to be targeted immediately. And research and development programs sometimes might satisfy both. You do a bit of research, at the same time you're doing some development work. But not everyone is cut out for that kind of research. Some of us want to do pure research, and this is where the partnership comes in, that others can push the development angle and also promote the partnership angle that you need. So there's need to balance short-term and long-term impacts. So I'm going to give a few examples from two projects. For example, the assets project, we were quantifying ecosystems, flows, what's happening to water, what's happening to biodiversity in the forest. And we said there's need to actually install weather monitoring equipment, water monitoring equipment, in order to generate the data. And that's what we needed for publications and engage with our scientific networks. But there were additional benefits that arose from doing that, in that the National Meteorological Service said we did not have weather monitoring stations where you have installed them, and therefore the data that you are generating is going to be integrated into the national data. Then the National Broadcasting said, yes, we also need to provide weather bulletins every day, and therefore we will include that kind of data. So you can see the ripple effects that are happening from simply interest in generating data to other key stakeholders that get interested. And the project has ended, but this is going on. The communities were trained, the institutions were trained, they monitor the weather, and it's being reported on the national television. But also you need to engage with the high-level policymakers and decision makers. And if you're able to get a minister, a cabinet minister to come, then the other senior people find reason to come. And we noticed when we had the Minister of Health come to give an opening speech, and then the other senior government officials also came up. And this is important because the politicians do rotate, but the senior government officers stay there a bit longer. And therefore, it is important that you engage with them. So thank you for listening, but I just wanted to show you, we have a lecturer project. So we've produced what we're calling the impact, which is 54 pages, lots of pictures. This is basically for the policymakers, for the politicians. For our academia friends, we have a book that is going to be published next year, which is 300 plus pages with lots of statistical analysis. And that's what we need to do. For the ESPA project, this is the first early warning system conference in Malawi. And the front page picture is actually one of the automated weather stations that we actually installed because of funding from ESPA. But the interesting thing is that a lot of school children from primary school and secondary school come and visit the station. And so this government officer now is a very important person, and that's the impact we didn't expect to happen, but it has happened because of the additionality. On the other end, they say that they are able to predict outbreak of pests because it gives wind direction, and if they have the pheromones, they're able to tell where the outbreak of certain moths are coming and where the outbreak of these caterpillars will happen. Finally, the water monitoring gauge that we installed and have trained community readers. In December last year, that guy in the village was able to warn downstream communities that what had been told by the water department, the level has been exceeded, so they should expect a flood in the next 2 hours. It happened again in February. That was not what we had envisaged. We were collecting water data for our publications, but it's bringing about these kinds of impacts. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sostin. And I know as an ex-public servant that used to always be what's impact? Well, it's what the minister notices. But I think the legacy is that we all believe in is our true impact. So we have these different lenses. Thank you, colleagues, for always stimulating points. I think it gives us a lot to talk about, a lot to reflect on. We're under bad chairmanship. We're coming to close to the point we need a coffee break, but I want to give Julia Kemp the opportunity to say something. Julia was, until recently, director of the East African DFID Research Hub, and very much at the core of our thinking in developing partnerships. And the smart-eyed amongst you will have noticed that her name is actually here. So Julia, I don't know if you want to say something, you can either use a microphone down there, and one will find its way to you, or you can come up here and be in a web stream. But perhaps, Arnaud, if you get the mic to Julia. So,
Thank
Julia.
You. Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't read that. Thanks very much for the invitation to join today. I think Mark has said, but DFID has been working very closely with Research Councils UK on the GCRF, because it really, if you look across the piece at the GCRF, at DFID's commitment to development research and the Newton Fund and the Ross Fund, this is a significant scale-up of the UK's ambition in this area. So I was asked just to give a couple of reflections, and I think actually the panel have said the key points, but maybe just to reflect back. I think one of the things that's quite important is to think about changing ways of working, particularly around those equitable partnerships. I don't think there's anyone in the room who will disagree with the notion of equitable partnerships. But in my experience and in sitting on the boards of Southern research institutions, have a look at the way in which your research officers work, how the practicalities actually play out. And Fergus, you put up a bullet saying, do you have 100% transparency on your budgets? You'd be surprised, and I certainly was working with DFID research projects, how many don't have that. So I think just look right through the cycle and how that partnership is working. So that would be one reflection coming back. The second, which I think was illustrated really well, was that challenge to work in the policy and implementation space. The most successful research projects that certainly DFID has funded have been the ones that have engaged in that very complex translation space for research. And it's about challenging everybody to in that engagement. I think, and I'm in danger probably in this room of saying this, but perhaps academics, it's not a natural home to work in that space, and that's the same for Southern academics as it is for Northern academics. So it's about having the right partners that you're working with, the right way of reaching out into that space. And I think, Madara, you had a great example of having government, the multilaterals, the private sector, civil society, all around the table, and that really is, in our experience, the way in which to engage in that space. And maybe just one more reflection, and that's to think forward. I've spent most of my career actually working in Africa, not uniquely, but what's very exciting at the moment is the commitment that's coming forward from governments on science, technology, and innovation. So although we're talking about a UK research fund here, actually you'll find that there are national initiatives coming forward which can make very complementary investments. And many of the governments that I've been working with recently in this space want to, if you like, find the research that's impact. They want to have something that demonstrates to their own governments of the value of science, technology, and innovation. So the more that you can link up, use these funds to transform, link up with those local investments. For example, often you won't be able to fund PhD research, but national investments can. So can we do that linking up? Because actually in the future, that's where the UK country partnerships are going to come from. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And I think that sets the scene for much of our discussions. How do we link up? How do we think more ambitiously? How do we really drive impact? How do we create partnerships? And how do we create trust around that? I'm going to use Chairman's privilege to be a bit late. So let's see if there are any questions or comments. If you've got them, please stick up your hand and wait till you've got a microphone and then say who you are. So one here, please, Arno.
Toby Bruce, Kew University. Very interesting discussion. Now, if we're addressing global challenges, then we would like to have global impact. So it's a very broad topic, but just frame this in broad terms. Say there's one particular piece of research which has led to a new way of doing things, which has been proven to be successful in one particular area. Then I think part of the consideration is how can we do the scaling up, so that you can, if it's working in one locality, then we would like the whole world to benefit from this because it's addressing a global challenge. So there's a difference between the research and the innovation, isn't there? Because the research will generate that innovation, but then there's also a process of scaling up, and it's just the sheer logistics of that which are actually beyond the creative, original, novel, excellent research. But that's something which the private sector has an incentive to deal with, because there's the profit incentive. It's a marketing issue. The more they sell to, the more profits they make. But as academics, that's if we found a new solution which is kind of pro-poor, which isn't a money-making exercise, then how do we deal with this issue of scaling up? And so I was just wondering if that topic could be considered, perhaps, please. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'm going to collect questions so that we can try and be efficient. So, other thoughts or questions? Yep, over here, please, Alison.
So,
Could you say who you are, please?
I'm Baba Inusa. I'm a pediatric hematology from King's College, Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital in London.
And Midlands extends to London, in case you didn't know.
So we are very keen in terms of partnerships with sickle cell and thalassemia with sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. But some of our collaborators are actually from the US, for example. Does it sit well with, there are certain skills they bring that is very different from our skills, and certain projects that they've done that actually we could translate them very successfully in sub-Saharan Africa. Is it possible? How can we ward so that we don't get into difficulty? We don't have to give them money, but at least what's the best way to succeed?
Okay, very good. I think that's one I'm going to come back to Mark on in a little while. But other questions? Yes, please, down here.
Hi, my name is Salah Arusi. I'm from Coventry University. I just had a question in relation to the new focus on Anglophone countries and the move away from Francophone countries. And I was wondering, first of all, what was the motivation behind that? So, for instance, I know in terms of UK government aid policies, there's a lot of work is done on the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo. So this move towards Anglophone country, does that mean that projects with the DRC are no longer an attractive, option? Thank you.
Okay, very good. I think that one's going to go to you as well, Mark. Other questions around? One over there, please.
Thanks. This is mainly, Professor Saravanan, University of Warwick. It's mainly looking at Mark. There's been greater emphasis on North-South collaborations and learning. I don't hear much about South-South learning and inter-LMIC collaborative projects. Is it expected that we create innovative ways of joined up working, or is that plan in the future to facilitate such inter-country collaboration, which obviously will involve UK, but more importantly between LMICs?
Okay, I'm going to take one last question. Somebody's waving at me. I don't know why.
It's a question from someone following on the web stream.
It's a question from someone on the web stream. Fantastic. Excellent. Go on.
I think it links to what colleague earlier was just saying. How will the GCRF address the global north-south divide in research?
Okay, so...
Richard Smithers.
Well done, Richard. I'm glad we've got an audience in the web stream. So we've had, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. Let me just quickly repeat them. Let me give the panelists the opportunity to comment, and then Mark, it's really for you to decide whether you want to answer them now or whether you do it after the break, because I suspect they're all pretty much focused on you. So first of all, scaling up of innovation, how might that happen? I suppose involving Innovate UK in the future, might give us a way into that, or it may not. Secondly is collaboration with existing developed countries in addressing these issues. The example of the US, is that possible within the ambit of GCRF, and let's say more generally in partnership. Thirdly, I think a very specific question about Anglophone focus. Is that a policy, or is that just simply what's been happening? Something around South-South learning, how one creates better joined up working in the South, and that's maybe one I'd like to hear from the panelists on. And then how GCRF might address the broader issues around the North-South divide. Again, perhaps I can hear from the panelists. So let me invite each of the panelists to reflect on any of these, and then Mark, finally I'll turn to you. So, ladies first.
Thank you. I just only give an example of scaling up. I work with BRAC. You might know that BRAC is the world's largest NGO. And researchers at International Center for Diarrheal Diseases, they invented the oral saline that could save lives of thousands and millions of children who suffer from diarrhea. So they invented it, and BRAC took it up, and BRAC scaled it up throughout the country. So the basic idea now so BRAC has this kind of model where we, the researchers, do research, come up with innovations, and they implement it. So this is one example but that leads to the question of how do we make the linkage between all the stakeholders? Like, how do we bring in the researchers and stakeholders together? But there are many examples in developing country contexts of scaling up. And non-formal primary education is another one that has been done. Tuberculosis, like drug-resistant tuberculosis, how we can deal with it. And again, government and BRAC working together, having centers where the patients can come and take their medicine. So there have been many innovations that have been scaled up, and there are people who can scale up. So it's not us, but there are people. Thank you.
Thanks, Fergus. Madara, one word, 1 minute.
Less than a minute. I'll also talk about scaling up in a different way. The project we have at University of Leicester has a low-cost sensor for air quality monitoring. They've spun off a company. They're not quite sure how it will work in the developing country context. Again, some of the issues I raised earlier. So that company is also involved with us on this project. They'll donate some sensors. And then we'll also contribute to some of the issues that are relevant, and they will then be responsible for scaling that up. The same project has the UNEP low-cost sensors that also have issues, so we're also involved with them trying to sort out some of those issues. And again, UNEP would now, with their partners, also be involved in scaling up. So I think the key thing with scale up is bringing some of these potential partners on board at the beginning.
Thanks, Madara. Sostin?
Thank you very much. In terms of scaling up, because research is an approach, and so you perfect the way you do certain things. And scaling up means that others also adopt the way you have conducted a certain research. And we've seen this in Malawi, that we were doing research in the south, but the results have been taken up by other projects and other programs outside the South, but also in the neighboring countries, for example, of Mozambique.
Thanks, Austin. Paul?
Okay, very quickly, in answer to the scaling up question, it depends. It depends on context. Sometimes you can use the same approach everywhere. And looking at aerosols might be an example. But in other sectors, the local context matters. So how do you know it? You listen to what Ferdos, actually all three of our colleagues have said there. Bring their ideas together and you will have designed a process which will give you a pretty fair idea of how to scale up. If you don't do it, you probably haven't got a chance. So this process, the social process of doing research for impact is really important. The other thing I want to point on, the questions about the North-South engagement and also South-South. Again, each of these colleagues here, they know how to do it. I've been part of some of these processes where I can sit back in the room and be a participant, where there's absolutely exciting, dynamic exchanges going on. Ferdos' project had a link between Tanzania and Bangladesh. SOSTEN was 2 South American countries and Malawi. The strength of that research was the South-South collaboration. And the secret is the UK researchers being able to let go of control, sit back and listen.
Thanks, Paul. Mark, do you want to pick up these points now? Right, as well. Very good. Quick. The Mark is between us and the coffee. No pressure.
Right. In terms of scaling up, I would say that's not a research council's traditional core competence, and my advice is always to look at funders in terms of where their core competence is. Personally, I think it's more with DFID, but actually, I'm aware one of the things that I've looked at recently is it's a problem that is recognised by development agencies around the world, and I'm aware that USA, DFID, the Australians, Canadians, as well as the foundations like Gates, Rockefeller, have a partnership around scaling up because they are looking for the good practices. So I don't think there is a universal approach, and I don't think there is anybody who thinks they are, they have a magic wand or a magic money tree or whatever for that. In terms of the geographic focus, just to be clear, the Anglophone, Francophone is an outcome. It's not a policy intent. And again, just to be clear, that at the moment we are fighting we have a position, let's be careful on language, we have a position where we have no explicit geographic bias. So what we are looking to do is orientate around the problems and the challenges and where the research questions are manifest. And often, research questions don't fit neatly into country categories. If you think about urbanisation, it could be that you're looking at comparative studies across regions as well as countries. So at the moment, we're not looking to favour or disfavour particular regions overtly. That might change, though, because there is a counter view on that. And in terms of specifically from the research councils on the use of our funding, it's fair to say that eligibility is a moving issue. And what's happened is that we've moved from a system where the majority of the research councils only funded activities within the UK, with a couple of exceptions, to one where we are increasingly open in terms of supporting partners around the world on in slightly different ways. So at the moment, for the call that Sian will cover this afternoon, we will fund research in research organisations around the globe, but we have a differential approach to developed countries, where we're looking for a commitment from those countries to support their research, as opposed to developing countries where we're trying to provide the same sort of generosity of support. And what I mean by that, as well as supporting the direct costs of research, we also want to make a commitment to support the research infrastructure and research environment as well. So I don't think we've reached the end point yet, but it is moving forward. And the other, I think, complication around eligibility is once you move from research organisations to other type of, if you like, public good organisations, NGOs, CSOs and so on, where, again, we're opening up our eligibility, but I don't think we've quite reached the end state on that yet, honestly.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you all, colleagues, for a stimulating panel, for a great start to our discussion. For those of you on the web stream, many apologies. You're probably tuning in thinking we're about to start again. We're just about to have a coffee break, so I guess we'll start again about 12:05. So if you haven't had your cup of coffee yet, wherever you may be sitting, please help yourself to do that. May I just ask you all to join me in thanking all of our panelists and Mark and his team for the discussion so far.